Hello and welcome to the Oak Spring podcast, where we celebrate the legacy of Mrs. Bunny Mellon through the work of the Oak Spring Garden Foundation. I'm Chris Stafford, and this is Season 3, Episode 5. On this month's episode, we're going to be highlighting the recently released digital and downloadable exhibition, George Washington and a Nation of Farmers, an exhibit that's been launched to coincide with the 250 years of Americans' independence in July. In just a moment, I'll be talking to the 24th Regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association to learn more about this exhibit. And later on in the program, as always, we'll be joined by Daniel Dede, our Director of Programs here at Oak Spring, to learn more about what's happening around Oak Spring with events and programs. But first, to our guest this month. In October 2024, the Indiana native and Harvard graduate Dede Neal Petri became the 24th Regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And as every American will know, George Washington was the first president of the United States from 1789 to 1797 and one of the founding fathers. And Mount Vernon is the home of George Washington's vast estate. It's furnished with period pieces and the president's own belongings. Located a little over an hour just to the east of Oak Spring on the Potomac River, Mount Vernon is owned and operated by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, the oldest national historic preservation organization in the United States. And joining me now is the 24th Regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, Dede Neal Petri. Dede, welcome to the Oak Spring podcast. Thank you for taking time to do this.
Well, my pleasure.
Well, it's lovely to have you because I know you have so many common interests with Oak Spring, and of course you're very passionate about gardening too. As I mentioned before, I did find that you were a former president of the Garden Club of America, so these are things that are dear to your heart.
Absolutely. Love the gardening world and all the things that Oak Spring are doing, and I think that there's great common bonds between George Washington's Mount Vernon and Oak Spring.
Well, of course, you've been at Mount Vernon now for a couple of years, I think since your appointment, almost 2 years, isn't it? It was October.
That's right, as the Regent, which is our way of saying the chairman of the board.
Chairman of the board. Well, it's a very grand title. I think it puts you up a notch, doesn't it, in terms of titles? Yeah. Much.
Yes, it's an interesting one. I think the Smithsonian Board of Regents is somewhat comparable, but yes, you don't see that term very often.
Now, I know you're a Harvard graduate, you're an Indiana native as well, and of course you've made Mount Vernon your home. So tell us a little bit more about that background and how you first discovered the Mount Vernon Ladies Association.
Well, I do think it goes back to my education. I was an American history and literature major at Harvard, although being in Boston, I must confess, I don't recall learning a thing about George Washington. I think it was all about Adams and the Adams family, but it has been a personal interest, and I went on from Harvard to law school and then ultimately was involved in the creation of a nonprofit that focused quite a bit on historical literacy and academic standards. And in 2000, I co-authored an article called Losing America's Memory. And at that time, I got to know the then head of Mount Vernon, Jim Reese, who shared concern about the declining historical literacy. And so we started to work together. I brought my annual meeting to Mount Vernon, eventually became a donor, and here we are today.
And so what's your day-to-day responsibilities then, broadly, Dede?
The association, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, has owned and managed George Washington's Mount Vernon since 1858. It is a really great story of female empowerment and commitment, and I think Bunny Mellon would have been a kindred spirit. And it's actually hard to believe, but mere 50 years after Washington's death, George Washington's Mount Vernon was nearly lost forever. The Washington family could no longer sustain the estate. The house was falling apart. There's some remarkable images where ship's masts are holding up the piazza. And the Washington family had gone to the Commonwealth of Virginia, had gone to the federal government in the hopes that they would be willing to take over the estate and sustain it. And both of them said no. And so to the rescue came this group, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, thanks to the real vision of one woman from South Carolina, Anne Pamela Cunningham. And it's a great story. Her mother was going down the Potomac. She looked up and she could see what a horrible state Mount Vernon was in. And she wrote to her daughter, Anne Pamela, and she said, if the men of America cannot take care of the home of our first president, perhaps the women can. And so Anne Pamela, who was unmarried and who had actually had some health issues, decided she would take this on as her life's work. And so she helped develop the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which is called Of the Union, something that I love to emphasize because we have to remember this was just before the Civil War. And I think there was a real hope on the part of Anne Pamela, as well as those ladies who were part of the initial board, that perhaps this great symbol of George Washington, who had brought the country together, who had focused on union, that perhaps his image and symbol could help keep the country together even in the late 1850s and into the early 1860s. And of course, we know that didn't happen, but nevertheless, he was the galvanizing force behind the creation of this organization.
So what got you excited when you were hired in this position then, Dede? Because you were embarking on the role at the start of two major preparation for two major exhibits and celebrations here, some real milestones in the history of Mount Vernon. So what was it that was getting you excited at the beginning?
Well, that's right. This is a 3-year term. And I think what was very exciting was the opportunity to work with the board on a strategic plan, among other things. Yes, this is 2026 and we celebrate 250 years of American independence. But we here at Mount Vernon are already focused on 2032, which will be the 300th birthday of George Washington. So we have just completed a strategic plan that will take us to 2032. It is ambitious. It is dedicated to inspiring and educating the world about George Washington. But I think a particular note where we blend with the purpose and interests of Oak Spring is a focus in our plan on land stewardship. Conservation and preservation are really central pieces of our work here. And it is our goal going forward to be even more engaged with our living collections and to look holistically at the nearly 500 acres that the Ladies Association owns here at Mount Vernon. I think most visitors are familiar with the historic core, which is about 40 acres. But as I say, we have a little less than 500 acres, a significant percentage of which is in forest. And we, as we look ahead, want very much to steward all of this property and to engage the really visionary work of George Washington when it comes to utilizing the land and seeing the power of the land for this new American nation.
Well, now that you're 3/4 of the way into your tenure, I'm wondering what seeds you're sowing beyond those two celebrations that you're coming to. What do you consider to be the seeds that you're sowing for the long-term vision of Mount Vernon?
Well, we've already seen some exciting steps forward when it comes to land stewardship. We have just brought on our first executive director of gardens and landscapes, Jonathan Cavalier. He comes to us from Dumbarton Oaks. We're very excited. He'll be heading up a new department here that not only looks at the gardens and grounds, but also the view shed, livestock, archaeology. So we're delighted to have him here. I have Peter Crane to thank for introducing us to Michael Gage. I know he is someone who is well known in the Oak Spring community because of our interest in understanding and managing our forests. We were very lucky to have Michael come and take a look at those forests and to produce a study for us. One of the things that he found that I think is most interesting is that there were 42 tree species on our property, something that he called absolutely remarkable on 400 acres of old farmland. And he compared the tree diversity on our property to that of Yosemite National Park, which he noted was much larger than that at Yosemite. So we were so pleased to have Michael help us as we look at issues that so many places are facing, whether it's invasives, basic threats to our ecosystems, so that we have a better understanding of the land that we own and how we can properly manage and steward it. And then I think another really exciting component of the work that we're undertaking is the development of a comprehensive landscape plan. We have brought on Nelson Bird Woltz and Principal Thomas Woltz to help us in what will be essentially a 16-month project to really look holistically at our landscapes, to determine how we use them, how we can interpret them, whether we can have more walking paths, whether we can do different access points, a whole array of exciting opportunities vis-a-vis sustainability and interpretation of George Washington.
Let's talk about your big event this year, celebrating 250 years, of course, of America's independence in July, is this new exhibition, George Washington and a Nation of Farmers. What was the concept behind this? What was the thinking about this and the planning? Where did it all begin?
Well, we all know George Washington as general and president, and I think in this anniversary year, there was some belief that it would be fun and different to be able also to look at George Washington's legacy as an amazing and visionary farmer. It seemed to be a wonderful time to look at something that probably gave Washington more joy than anything else. I think he preferred farming to military command and public office. And so why not take this anniversary to look at this component of his civic responsibility, how he was attempting to create a nation of farmers that could serve the world and could serve the new American nation. And I've got to say, having worked with Peter Crane earlier on a panel exhibit on Frederick Law Olmsted, he and I put our heads together and said, shall we do this? And here we are today with a brand new exhibit with absolutely exquisite panels designed by Max Smith. They're just fantastic.
For those who are not familiar with that Olmsted 200 celebration, can you just tell us a little bit more about that and how that came about for you to be involved?
Yes, I at that time was the president of the Olmsted Network, and Frederick Law Olmsted, whom we most famously know as the designer of Central Park, was celebrating his 200th birthday back in 2022. And so I was working on developing nationwide celebrations for that great landscape architect. And Sir Peter and I came together and worked on a special panel exhibit about Olmsted's work. And again, Max was our fantastic artistic director of that endeavor.
Now, this exhibit that is going to be available digitally as well as in person is highly complex and quite nuanced. Can you tell us what your visitors can expect there and what will be on the digital version of this?
Yes, as you say, it is available to download or it can be enjoyed online. It's 18 panels, 16 of content, which really look at the visionary work of George Washington. I mean, he was an innovator, and people who visit this exhibit will learn about that innovation. He had developed a new plow. He helped construct a 16-sided barn. He created one of my favorite places on the estate, something we call the Sterkerary, which is the dung repository. I think this will be one of the revelations of this exhibit, that George Washington was the composter in chief as well, and that he had a remarkable facility where water would come literally from the mansion through special conduits that had been developed to take rainwater into the compost heap so that it would be wet and could be used as fertilizer around the estate. So it's just remarkable aspects of this kind of thinking that I think we don't often associate with George Washington. And we'll see how he connected with the much broader new husbandry movement, which involves not only George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, but other individuals like Arthur Young and other English experts with whom Washington corresponded so that America could benefit from the international thinking about husbandry.
Were there any surprises for you, Dede, when you were doing your research on this about George Washington, the farmer?
I think it's interesting to see the evolution of his thinking because of his desire to bring scientific husbandry to America. I think it was one of the reasons that his thinking about slavery evolved, because I think over time he realized that one could not have a vibrant agrarian culture in America that was based on coerced labor. And so it was very much shaping his decision ultimately at his death to free the slaves that he owned. I think that's a very interesting piece of this story, and it's something that Bruce Ragsdale outlines in his book, George Washington at the Plow, which is the foundation of this exhibit. We were lucky to be able to have Bruce curate this exhibit, and so it is a story of George Washington's evolving thought personally, as well as his vision for America to be the granary for the world.
Tell us about the recently discovered sealed glass bottles in his cellar. I'm curious about that.
Yes, absolutely. We have been engaged for the last 3 years in a mansion revitalization project. It's the largest project in the history of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and it has involved basically returning the mansion to what George Washington would have known in 1799. Over many years, we've determined that some of the sills were no longer functioning, that there was a real need to restabilize the foundations, which we have done. But in the course of doing that, our archaeologists were engaged in making certain that we knew what was in the cellar before we engaged in any way. And much to their surprise, what did they find but buried, I think, 35 bottles of fruit, largely cherry, some gooseberry, some currants, and amazingly well preserved. And so when they opened these bottles, there was a fresh whiff of cherry and fruit. And as I like to say, this gives new meaning to significant historic preservation. We think that these were probably bottled in 1775, likely by Doll, an enslaved cook who was known to be particularly good in dealing with fruits that were grown on the property, that they were buried in these bottles in the cellar. And then life intervened. In 1775, George Washington goes off to become the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And we think that these bottles were forgotten. And so here we are 200 plus years later, we find them. And it gives us a wonderful new contact point with our first president and what was growing here at Mount Vernon.
How many are there, Dede, and where can they be found?
We have been working with Jamestown and also with the agriculture department. There's some hope that we might be able genetically to take some of the pits that were found in these bottles and to recreate some of the trees that were on the estate. As there were 35 bottles, and most of them were remarkably well preserved, the bottles themselves as well as the fruit. So it was, I think, really a remarkable discovery and testimony to the ongoing work that we do here at Mount Vernon. We are not a static effort. We are constantly engaged in research, whether it's be through George Washington's papers and Martha Washington's papers, or whether it's through archaeology to examine what we find in and around the mansion and the outbuildings. And so it's been a very exciting component of our restoration project to find these new revelations, which then help us interpret George Washington even more fully.
You mentioned earlier the plow and the barn and him being a composter as well. I'm wondering if there are any more practices, any other practices that still have some influence in modern day farming.
Oh, I think so. It's interesting. I don't believe Washington would have called it regenerative agriculture. That's certainly what we talk about today. And I think he was a very good example of someone who was engaging in regenerative agriculture. He certainly understood the power of livestock. He was exploring manure and doing experiments on the healthiest soils. He would look and mix dung. He would go into the river and find some river mud and was experimenting, as so many were at that time in the late 18th century, to sort of see what would produce the healthiest crops. And so this is, again, part and parcel of this exhibit, how he developed a visionary 7 crop rotation system, how he very early on abandoned tobacco. I think he realized that not only did he have no control, since that was really part of the British mercantile system at the time, he had no control really over the prices he'd be able to get, but he also realized that tobacco was seriously destroying the soil. And so I see him, and we depict this in the exhibit, as an early conservationist, someone who was really thinking about healthy soil, healthy ecology, and so he moves to wheat and corn. He has more control over the markets in this case, and also can really look to the health of the soil. And being a big entrepreneur, what does he do? He also has a very successful grist mill and distillery. He was somebody who was focused on the bottom line. And so that aspect of Washington as entrepreneur comes out also in this exhibit.
When he left office, I think it was 1797, did he return to farming?
He did. He came back to Mount Vernon and really dedicated himself almost full time to farming. As I say, this was something that he loved dearly. There's a Bible verse that was often used about living under his own vine and fig tree. And I think there was no place that he loved more than Mount Vernon, which he called the most pleasantly situated estate in all America. He had about 8,000 acres. He was looking very closely at this land. He, as I say, developed a 7-field crop rotation, trying to figure out efficiencies, productivity, how he could engage in practices that could be examples for other farmers, because at that time, the new husbandry movement was one that urged educated landholders to supervise their farms, to share experiments through associations and publications. And this was something that Washington took on very, very seriously. And I think in those years after the presidency, he viewed a very key opportunity for him was to provide this kind of example vis-a-vis farming and the American landscape.
Well, going back to the exhibition, how can audiences engage, Dede, with the exhibition online?
It's called George Washington and a Nation of Farmers. So you can Google that title and you will find it on the Mount Vernon website. There you can register and download the exhibit for free. It can be printed in various sizes and displayed inside and out. Our hope is that it would be a wonderful resource for community centers, for libraries, for garden clubs. I'm very happy to say that the exhibit debuted at the Philadelphia Flower Show. And we are working right now with the American Horticultural Society, which I believe will be showcasing it. I know that Oak Spring will have it on display during the Virginia Garden Days and the Minnesota State Fair and others. So we really urge people across the country to take advantage of this resource, which, as I say, is free, and to bring it this aspect of Washington's legacy to the fore in their communities.
And we will, of course, put a link in our show notes to the website, mountvernon.org. And finally, Dede, what else would you like our listeners to know about this exhibition? And then, of course, about Mount Vernon?
Well, Mount Vernon is an 18th century plantation. We are still, I think, the most visited estate in America. And so in 2026, as we celebrate American independence, we invite all Americans to come and visit us. We have been engaged in this massive renovation project, as I said, so that the mansion now looks more like it did in Washington's time than ever before. The Wall Street Journal just recently had an article that said that we had returned these rooms so that Washington would feel quite at home were he to walk right in the door. So we want people to come and visit the mansion, to see the renewed and restored bedchamber where Washington died, a beautiful new wallpaper based on our research that it just makes the room glisten. We have a brand new education center that has just opened that showcases George Washington's character and leadership. It looks at his farming legacy. It looks at his work in ensuring religious liberty. It looks at his work at the Constitutional Convention, and certainly his great legacy as our first president. There are many places on the estate, the farm, the blacksmith shop, the woodland walk, the 12-acre field. There are just many things to do here. A Revoir weekend will be here in early May. So we just invite all America to come and visit us. And if you can't come personally, then come to our website, download this exhibit, bring George Washington to your home wherever you are.
Dede Neal Petri, 24th Regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the podcast. And we look forward to seeing you back here at Oak Spring.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Joining me now, as always, our regular segment here on the podcast is Daniel Dede, who's our Director of Programs here at Oak Spring, with all the latest news of what's happening here at Oak Spring this summer. Lots going on, as always, Danielle. So what are the highlights that you'd like to tell us about?
Hey, Chris, it's great to be back this month. So now that we are halfway through May, we've wrapped up, for the most part, our busy season of tours, our first kind of wave of tours that come through April. So that is our Virginia Historic Garden Week tours that we just had, as well as our garden preview in April. Those were sold out events where we had close to, in total, about 1,000 people, 500 people a day coming through the formal garden and our gallery and seeing our property. So that is what we really focus on in April. And now halfway through May, we're looking towards our next set of open days that will be in June, in late June. And then as far as our residencies and fellowships, we just wrapped up our 2-week interdisciplinary residency and our first session of our botanical artist in residency. So we just had 10 residents in total take off. And then in a couple of weeks, we will have our second session of our 5-week interdisciplinary residents arriving on site. And then also importantly, at the end of this month, we have the application deadline for all of our 2027 interdisciplinary residencies and all of our fellowships. So for any artists, researchers, scientists who are looking to come experience Oak Spring through our residency programs, be sure to submit an application before that deadline is upon us.
And of course, it's a transition time for the farm and garden. With the spring plantings, what's going on there that you've been watching?
Yeah, so in May, our farm is kind of transitioning from their spring crops and getting a lot of our summer crops into the ground. We are also this week, we are starting our CSA, Community Supported Agriculture Program. So we have about 50 individuals that sign up for that program, mostly neighbors and people in our local area who pay a fee and then come each week and pick up a box of fresh veggies, whatever's in season. So that's a big focus of what our farm team does. And then throughout the year, but especially during the summer months, the prime growing time in Virginia, they're also donating at least half, sometimes closer to 75% of the produce to our local food banks. So things are definitely starting to get quite busy over at our farm right now.
And, of course, you'll be hosting a large conference here shortly on historical ecology and art history. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so we've been organizing a conference with Marlise Duguid, who is at Yale at the School of Environment there, as well as Dana Warren from Oregon State University. And they had the idea to have a conference that is about art history and ecology. So looking primarily at paintings from the Hudson River Valley painters and kind of early American painter depictions of the landscape, and seeing how those can be used as a resource for ecologists trying to understand the plants and environment at that time. So this conference will bring together about 30 individuals, evenly split between art historians and ecologists at varying points in their career. Some people are more early career, some are quite late career and established. So everyone will come together and look at paintings, talk about the plants represented in them from both an art historical perspective as well as an ecological perspective. So we're really looking forward to that conference. It will just be 3 nights that they're here with us, and we are definitely looking forward to sharing more about the outcomes of that conference in the months to come.
Is there any information people can find online? Can they be a part of this? Is there somewhere to go to get engaged with this conference?
At this point, there's not quite yet anything that we've shared publicly, but that will definitely be a topic of the conference, is what we want to do with our findings, with the conversations that are had at the conference. Part of the culmination of the conference will be talking about what the outputs are and how we can share these conversations publicly.
Well, looking ahead to June, of course, you've got the annual Feast in the Field. Remind everybody what that looks like, because that's become quite a big event, hasn't it now?
Yeah, so that's about a 60-person dinner at our biocultural conservation farm, delicious food prepared by our chef, Jason, and that's a fundraising ticketed event that we host. So the proceeds from that go to fund our local education and outreach efforts. So we have a team of about 5 educators who work, and they work very closely with our farm team as well. And they go to local community centers and libraries, as well as bringing students out to our farm to lead educational programs. And the programs that they offer are all free. So the tickets to this event and some of our other programming all go to support these subsidized programs that we offer as well.
And that information, of course, will be on the website, osgf.org.
Yeah, exactly. That would be under osgf.org, programs, one-day events. So that's where you can find the tickets for our Feast in the Field, and other programs that are coming up would be under one-day events.
Are there any short courses that you're getting ready for, Danielle, right now?
Yeah, so we still have the application open for cultural and natural ecologies, which is more academic and scholarly class taught by Amy Myers, who was the former head of the Yale Center for British Art, as well as Therese O'Malley. And so that class is still open. And then we also have applications now open for a new class, which is our viticulture class that is about growing grapes and making wine. So that will be a really fun new class that we're offering with Tremaine Hatch, who is a professor at Virginia Tech and a grape grower and winemaker himself. So applications for that are also open and available on our website.
So that part wraps up the events then for us to look forward to in the coming weeks and months. Danielle, I know you'll be back next month in June to give us an update then, and also a review of recent events. So finally tell everybody how they can find us and reach us here at Oak Spring.
Yes, so our followers can reach us on Instagram at Oak Spring Garden Foundation. We are also on X at Oak Spring, and we're on Facebook as well. So definitely reach out to us on social media if you see a program or event that you're interested in. Of course, the most up-to-date place is always directly on our website, which is osgf.org. And then our upcoming events that folks can register from would just be under that programs tab. And then anyone who has any further questions can always reach out to us via email. The best address is programs@osgf.org.
Well, that wraps up our episode for this month. My thanks again to our guest this month, Dede Neal Petri, who told us more about the George Washington and a Nation of Farmers exhibit that's being held at Mount Vernon. And the website again is mountvernon.org. So my thanks again to Dede for coming on the show. And to you, as always, Danielle. It's always good to catch up and hear what you're working on.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
And thank you for listening. Don't forget to share this on social media and give us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you're listening, and let anybody else know who you think might enjoy the podcast too. I'll be back next month with another episode of the Oak Spring podcast. Until then, thank you for listening.